So it will. Do you know that there is a publishing company that wants to make life easier for you as a writer? This publishing company is called World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We publish in all different languages, and we're looking for writers of all genres, all formats. We're looking for scholars, ghostwriters, playwrights, poets, short fiction, novelists, you name it. We're looking for anybody who is interested in writing and the craft of writing to be in touch with us. You can reach us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. With World Inkers Printing and Publishing, you do not require a lot of money to publish with us. Contact us today at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. Become a winner with other authors at World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Give us a shot. We will surely finish you. Hi, welcome to Parrot TV's Foreign Policy Review. I'm Dustin Pickering, and today we're going to discuss the Western lies of the Russian narrative concerning the failure of Russia to win and succeed in this war on the Ukraine. So we have CARLO Parcelli, my co-host, and Billy Bob is with us again. And we also have special guest Scott Ritter, and I'm going to allow him to introduce himself, tell us a little bit about himself, and then we can move forward with our discussion. I know you guys out there are really anticipating this show today, so keep a good firm eye out and keep watching the show for a good perspective on this issue. So Scott, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I was former Marine. I was commissioned in the Marine Corps in 1984, was made an intelligence officer. I spent some time preparing for combat with the Soviet threat back in the 1980s. The Soviet Union was our number one threat, so I was heavily involved in training to close with and destroy the Soviet enemy through firepower and maneuver. Fortunately, the balloon never went up. We didn't go to war with the Soviet Union. Instead, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated two classes of nuclear weapons in December of 1987. And I was picked to be one of the inspectors to implement this treaty. And so from February of 1988 until July of 1990, I worked in the Soviet Union outside of a missile factory in the city of Vodkinsk, where I helped implement the treaty to ensure that the Soviets were in compliance with their obligations under that treaty. It was a unique experience, one that was very rewarding. I left that job, like I said, in July of 1990, went back to the Marine Corps, and ended up getting caught up in the preparations for Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Assigned to the Commandant Marine Corps as part of an ad hoc planning cell to plan military operations against the Iraqis, and then later assigned to General Schwarzkopf's staff, where I, because my experience in the Soviet Union, was considered to be a ballistic missile expert. And so I was given the counter Scud portfolio, and I spent a lot of time working with the U.S. Air Force and various special operations forces, trying to interdict Iraqi Scuds before they were fired against either Israel or the Arabian Gulf. I left the Marine Corps in June of 1991. Thought I was going to sneak away into civilian life, but I was called back into service. The United Nations asked me to come and help them because of my intelligence background, my arms control background, and my experience during the war, to create an intelligence unit as part of the United Nations Special Commission, which was tasked by the Security Council with disarming Iraq in the aftermath of Desert Storm. So from September of 1991 until August of 1998, nearly 7 years, I worked as an intelligence officer and then later as a chief weapons inspector. I participated in over 40 missions into Iraq, 14 of those as chief weapons inspector, and had a very prominent role in implementing the disarmament of Iraq. I resigned in August 1998, protesting what I deemed to be undue influence or interference by the United States on the work of the inspectors. And I've been speaking out against what I consider to be bad U.S. policy ever since.
Excellent. That's quite a resume for the program. So, well, let's see with Carlo. What do you have to say about what you're hearing so far about this Russia-Ukraine crisis?
Well, I just want to get right into a question for
Go
Scott,
for it.
because
Excellent.
that's I think what we're here for. This morning, let's just cut to the chase. My local fish wrap here in Washington D.C., the Washington Post, had an article which reads: "U.S. says Putin being misled as Ukraine refugee tallies hits 4 million." And what it basically, U.S. means U.S. intelligence and unnamed sources. I've never understood why the parents of the progeny for intelligence officers never name their children, but they're always unnamed sources. But besides the fact that 2.5 million Eastern Ukrainians had fled the Donbass because of the shelling that had gone on for 8 years, and now the numbers apparently, according to Western sources, exceeds the 2.5 million that had already fled, that got no mention in my local fish wrap, the Washington Post. This article purports, at least in part, I don't think they had enough information to make a whole article, or they couldn't cook up enough information. But it's called about Putin being misled, and I'd like to ask Scott what his feelings are about how Putin is being misled by his military brass and his advisors. Get his opinion on that.
Well, as a former intelligence officer whose parents did name him, I think I might have some insight into this issue. First of all, let's just start with the purpose of the article. Let's just break it down into brass tacks. To believe the premise of the article, someone in the U.S. government declassified information for the sole purpose of releasing it to the press to be published at a given time. So what we're talking about isn't classic intelligence. As an intelligence officer, to be frank, my job was never, in fact, I was prohibited from influencing the American public. That wasn't my job description. That's for the public relations people. My job was to collect information, assess information, and package it into usable information that could guide my commanders or the recipients, maybe civilian leadership, to have a better understanding of a situation so they could make decisions, informed decisions. So what we're talking about here is not really intelligence, we're talking about propaganda. And now the other thing is, intelligence is generally, it's a cycle. We collect information, then we assess the information, and then we package it as a product, which we call intelligence, but it only achieves its end result when it's given to the consumer who uses it and then asks new questions, which keeps the cycle going. This isn't designed to keep a cycle going. This is designed to achieve a propaganda end. So what is the information? Let's break it down. Putin has been misled. Now, how would you know? How would you know this? Because I used to, for instance, my boss used to say, Scott, one of the big questions we have, the request for information, is what is Putin being told by his advisors? I'd say, well, that's a heck of a question. And I'd break it down into the essential elements of information, specifically, who talks to Putin, how do they talk to Putin, et cetera. And then I'd figure out how to collect on that. So if I want to get into Putin's inner circle, which I would imagine is one of the most difficult intelligence problems facing the U.S. intelligence community today, I would have to either have a human source, someone sitting at the table, or somebody who has, through various means, has access to somebody who's sitting at the table so they can get the information directly about what's being discussed, or I have to be listening in on the conversation. Both of those are the most sensitive intelligence collection techniques in the intelligence business. They are classified way up here, and they are never declassified for release to the public. Because in doing so, you potentially compromise. Let's say we actually had a human source. And now the Washington Post runs this article. You're telling the Russians that there's somebody in the inner circle who's ratting out Putin's inner conversations. That's so right off the bat, let's eliminate, just from a logical standpoint, that this information isn't coming from a communications intercept or a human source. So where's it coming from? It's coming from somebody like me, an intelligence analyst sitting at my desk being asked the question, what do you think is going on inside the Kremlin? And now I have to deal with my reality. Let's say I'm an actual Russian expert. I am, by the way. I'm a Soviet Foreign Area Officer. That was my job. I would sit there and say, well, I'm going to look at this from the perspective of Putin and the Russian system. I would assess the Russian system. I would take a look at how they historically act with one another. And I would say that Putin is briefed multiple times a day by some of the most professional people in the Russian military and Russian foreign ministry who give him an honest and accurate assessment about what's going on so that he can guide the overall operation. He's not Joseph Stalin. He doesn't pick up a phone and say, move the 3rd Battalion 3 inches to the left on the map there. No, he tells the guys, proceed with the operation to complete the task of denazification, demilitarization. And so then I would write that assessment. But here comes the problem. My product, because I'm a junior analyst, most of your true experts are junior analysts because I haven't been corrupted by promotion yet. So I submitted up the chain to somebody who has been corrupted by promotion, middle management. Now, middle management asked me that question not because they want the truth. They asked it because somebody in the White House or somebody in the Pentagon said, you know, we'd like to believe that Putin's being misled. So they're already guiding this. So I send it up and my guy goes, no, that's not the answer we're looking for. Why don't you take a look at this and come up with a new assessment that maybe suggests that Putin's being misled, because that's what we'd like to believe. We have some cherry-picked intelligence here from a variety of rumor sources that suggest that maybe there's dissatisfaction inside the Kremlin, and we need you to back that up with an intelligence assessment. So we're looking at manufactured propaganda. It's not even intelligence anymore, because the second you corrupt it with this level of political interference, it ceases to become intelligence and it only becomes propaganda. This kind of propaganda is eminently declassifiable, meaning that it can be written for the sole purpose of being released to the press so that we create the impression, because the Washington Post is one of those newspapers that becomes a trendsetter in the media business. So if something's published in the Washington Post, it's picked up by other agencies, and now we have a story developing that dominates the news cycle for domestic political purposes. That is to convince the American population that Russia's losing the war. But you know, Russia doesn't care what the American people think. Vladimir Putin and Shoigu and Gerasimov and the others aren't losing any sleep by what's written in the Washington Post, nor are they concerned about what the Washington Post story is picked up by the Europeans and promulgated or parroted by the Ukrainians, who were probably the source of some of this information to begin with, because the Ukrainians are desperate to convince their own people that Russia is losing, they are winning. The real purpose of this is to generate residual spin as part of an overall information warfare program to impact public opinion inside Russia. The idea right now is to demoralize the Russian people, to get dissatisfaction, to build upon what many people in the West thought was going to be a burgeoning, mass demonstration of dissatisfied Russians who would rise up, destabilize Putin, maybe even overthrow Putin through some sort of color revolution. That's the purpose of the Washington Post story. That's the sole purpose, because convincing the American people that Russia's losing isn't hard to do when you've already demonized Russia over the course of many years and conditioned the American public to accept at face value anything negative said. So this is a lot of effort to do something that's already been accomplished. It's targeting the Russians, but if you take a look at the polls, I mean, Putin was, hovering around 68% before the war. He's over 80% now. As I said, in the middle of this, Russia doesn't care. Russia doesn't care about anything that's going on here. Russia has divorced itself from the West, economically, politically, ideologically. They really don't care about anything we say because nothing we say matters. The only thing that matters is what the Russian troops are doing inside Ukraine, and nothing the Washington Post writes is going to change that one bit. That's a long answer. I apologize.
No, it was a great answer.
Very thorough.
I just want to add that you guys are much younger than I am, and I cut my teeth with the Washington Post and intelligence on the Church Committee and the Pike Committee, and it was revealed by the Frank Church Committee that 100 individuals at the Washington Post had ties or were direct agents with the Central Intelligence Agency, and I have a feeling that that number has been ramped up in recent years. But thanks for that answer. It was a great answer.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Billy Bob, I know you've got questions.
What do you have to add to the conversation?
I don't want to take any time away from Scott. So Scott's the expert. We're really happy to have you here, Scott. And I've been watching most of your interviews. There's a long 2.5 hour one that was really great. But has anything come up that you would like to discuss? Anything new? Any new happenings? I know Russia was going to be demanding payment for their oil in rubles. That's starting today or tomorrow. I think it's starting today. I'm not sure. But anything you want to talk about specifically that's kind of new?
Well, there's the two. I think there's two big developments. The first is the one you just talked about, or I mean, I'm not giving priority. One of the ones is one you just talked about, which is the Russians finally starting to play some of their economic counterattack cards. They sit there. They sat there and took a whole bunch of punches from the West through the implementation of sanctions, and they really didn't do anything. But slowly but surely, you saw the Russians moving the pieces on the chessboard. First, smartly shutting down their market so their market wouldn't collapse, because markets are based upon perception and speculation. So they shut it down so that they could redefine a new economic reality in Russia, which was divorced from the West. And that's perhaps one of the more important things to take away is Russia is either already done it or is in the process of completely divorcing itself economically from the West. Russia has said never again will it allow the West to use economic interaction to threaten Russian national security. So they did that, which means, and then the West did something really stupid, which was to freeze Russia's sovereign wealth fund. In looking at that, I don't know. I don't have a phone. I can't pick up and ask Vladimir Putin, hey, was this a trap that you set for us? But to me, it looks an awful lot like a trap to accumulate a whole bunch of foreign currency reserves that are kept overseas because of legal purpose. That's how business works. You have the reserves there, you sell oil, the money's taken care of at these banks, etc. Meanwhile, while accumulating a tremendous amount of gold reserves at home. And it's like a giant minnow for the NATO Western fish to eat. And we went for it hook, line, and sinker, and we froze their assets, and we bragged about it. And Putin said, by freezing our assets, you have defaulted on everything. We can no longer trust you. We no longer want to be a part of it. You want those worthless dollars and euros? They're yours, because everything's going to be done in rubles now. And, oh, by the way, we're linking the ruble to the gold standard, which means we're no longer a Western debt-oriented economy. Our economy is actually based on something tangible called gold. And if you want to do business with us in the future, you got to do it with rubles. Or maybe if we're working with the Chinese, we'll come up with a ruble to yuan thing. If we're working with India, we'll have a ruble to rupee. But the dollar and the euro, done. We're finished. It's over. And tomorrow is the day, April 1st. And I don't think it's an April Fool's joke being played by the Russians on the world. Vladimir Putin just gave a speech today where he said, if you haven't bought the gas with rubles by tomorrow, the switch goes off. And for Germany, and the Germans are just now waking up. to the reality of about what's to happen to them. The German economic planners have come back to the Chancellor Scholz and said, hey, it's not that our economy is going to stall, that our economy is going to shut down terminally. We're going to shut down for 6 months. And at that time, the damage becomes permanent, and there's nothing we can do to prevent it. If you allow this to happen and Russia hits the off switch, there is no plan B. There is no gas available. There is nothing. And we will not only shut down, but we will die as a society. And this has caused Scholz to suddenly panic, and they're in emergency negotiations right now with the Russians about, guess what? Buying rubles so they can buy gas. Some nations like Poland claim that they're holding firm. They're going to find out the hard way that Putin doesn't bluff. And so is anybody France, Macron thinks he has a special relationship with Putin. He doesn't. It's not that special. He doesn't get an exception. His nation's on the enemies list, and anybody who's on the enemies list must buy not just gas, but everything in rubles. This means titanium. This means nickel. This means iron. This means all the commodities that Russia dominates the global market in, which will now be denied to Western industry because of the stupidity of the people who broadcast their intent to sanction Russia months in advance, giving Russia plenty of time to come up with a counter. And the counter is being played right now, and Russia is winning this. They opened up their market. Their market's rebounding. The ruble, Biden was bragging. I collapsed the ruble. I collapsed the ruble. It's worth nothing. It's worth everything now. And it's going to be worth even more thanks to you. But Biden is the best gift the Russian economy could have ever asked for. That's one major thing, is that the Russians are winning the economic war that's been going on between the West and Russia, and they're going to win, and they're going to win decisively. I can't predict that the dollar is going to collapse, but the dollar is losing, the stature that it held prior to this. And whether other nations continue to work with the dollar has yet to be seen. Saudi Arabia is talking about, selling gas with China using the yuan, which is a departure from the dollar. And when a nation like Saudi Arabia is no longer purchasing or selling oil using the dollar, that means that all these massive reserves of petrodollars that are out in the world start to lose their value. And as an American, I'm very nervous about this because it's going to hurt me, it's going to hurt you, it's going to hurt everybody. But, we brought it on ourselves. The other big development is what the Russians call the end of phase 1 of military operations and the beginning of phase 2. And this is important because a lot of it's not important from the Russian perspective. It's their operation. They get to implement it as they want, and they will. They don't care what we think. But here in the West, there was the notion that Russia was going to win this war over. Well, first of all, I mean, it can't say that, because I remember at the beginning when Russia put 200,000 troops, there were a lot of these talking heads on TV saying that's not enough troops. Ukraine's a nation of 40 million. Kiev has 3 million. There's not enough troops to invade. Russia's bluffing. Then we were told, no, imminent invasion. And then the invasion came. And as soon as the invasion came, one of the first things the Russians did is charge down out of Belarus towards Kiev. And everybody went, oh, the Russians are trying to capture Kiev. The Russians never said they were trying to capture Kiev. All the Russians did is maneuver forces around Kiev. Now, you can study Napoleonic warfare. I've told people, if you want to learn about the basic precepts of maneuver warfare, read Jomini's Art of War. Not because Napoleonic war is how we wage war. Concepts of a main attack, a diversionary attack, a feint, fixing, flanking. These are all Napoleonic concepts that were done with formations on the battlefield that, we could draw nice little maps and show how it worked. But these are concepts that existed that were then furthered by a guy named Little Hart, who wrote a book, The Strategy of the Indirect Attack, that dealt with World War II. And here he's talking about taking infantry and cavalry and turning them into tanks and into airplanes, and now we're getting big arrows moving on a map. And I actually helped implement the modern version of this in Desert Storm. You know, when people take a look at Desert Storm, this is maneuver warfare writ large. We carried out an amphibious feint off the coast of the Kuwaiti coast to fix fix a dozen divisions on the coast that could maneuver. The Marines carried out a fixing attack on the Kuwaiti-Saudi border to fix the Iraqi army there. 1st Cavalry Division did a diversionary attack up the Wadi al-Batin to keep the Republican Guard fixed in place, while the main attack went around the left flank, the famous Hail Mary hook, to outflank and roll up the Iraqis. It was pure maneuver warfare. Now, we sat there and we accept this because we're Americans, and of course, our military officers are geniuses who can, obviously, we know the art of war and everything. Well, guess who else is a genius? The Russian military. They are actually more educated than our officer corps. They have very stringent educational standards, strict professional standards, and their guys know how to draw big arrows on maps too. And it appears that the Russians put a big arrow down from Belarus for the purpose of feint. It was a feint, an attack, a diversionary attack that got the Ukrainians to say, "Oh my God, we have to reinforce Kiev," which means those reserves that they had in Western Ukraine, instead of moving east, moved north into Kiev, and then they fixed them in place by continually maneuvering around Kiev. And then people started to say, I mean, something was genius. They just stood there. They had a 40-mile-long convoy that just stood there, and everybody's going, "What's going on?" But while everybody's scratching their head about what's going on, all those Ukrainian forces are stuck there trying to figure out, how do we deal with this 60-mile convoy that's threatening Kiev? It wasn't threatening Kiev. How do you take a city of 3 million with 40 to 50,000 men? You don't. You can't. It's impossible. But the Russians did this, but everybody said they're losing because they're not taking Kiev. The same thing with Kharkov, the second largest city. You have over 1 million people there. You really want to occupy a city of 1 million? With what? How many men is that going to tie up? Or do you create packed around the flank, forcing the Ukrainians to reinforce Kharkov and keeping those forces from the main battle, which is being fought in East Ukraine, where over 100,000 of the Ukraine's finest forces are locked in conflict in the Donbass. That's the battle. And so they did this. They have created a land bridge between Crimea and the main part of Russia along the Sea of Azov. They've captured Mariupol, freeing up a line of communication. They pushed the Ukrainians back, and now they're going to implement phase 2, which is to withdraw the key strike elements from the Kiev feint, bring it down to the flank here, take the 40,000 men that are freed up because Mariupol fell. And that gives you an idea. Mariupol was a city of 300,000. And in order to invest it and capture it, it took 40 to 50,000 Russian troops out of a force of 200,000. You can't do that more than once. You can't do it up in Kharkov. So that's why they're not trying to capture the cities. Those 40,000 are maneuvering to the south, and now you're going to have a classic pincer operation that is going to trap 100,000 Ukrainian forces in a cauldron where they will be eliminated. This is phase 2. But the West can't handle the concept. Russia actually has strategic vision. So they're calling this a Russian defeat. They're calling the redeployment actually a regrouping, and this led to the fiction that Putin has somehow been misled by his officers about the Russian military capable. I think the Russians are doing just fine, and phase 2 is about to happen, and the Ukrainians are about to lose this war in a dramatic fashion.
Wow.
Yeah.
Impressive. So does Carlo or Billy Bob, do you have anything to add to the?
Yeah, I've got another question.
Mm-hmm.
But Scott just answered one of my questions, but I have many more. This one involves an article. We follow you very closely, Mr. Ritter, and this one involves the article you put up about the legal precedent for that Putin and the Russians have put toward the invasion itself, and in that you cite Grotius, considerably, and I actually have a 1746 edition of Grotius's work on war here, translated into French, but that's not my point. I wanted to ask you. I didn't see in the article that, and I'm going back to one of my initial points, that the 2.5 million people who fled the bombardment on the Donbass, the Russian-speaking Ukrainians who fled wouldn't that also be a pretext for the Russian invasion and of course the massing of troops along Donbass just weeks before Putin invaded, or actually over months, troops that were aligned and armed and trained by NATO and U.S. and by NATO and U.S. forces and funded by U.S. forces. Wouldn't that also be part of a legal pretext of a kind of self-defense argument that legally, I'm obviously no legal expert, but wouldn't that have some import toward that article that you just wrote? Anyway,
well, absolutely. I mean, when we look at the what constitutes a just war, there's two concepts or two legal authorities that have emerged since the end of the Second World War. One is founded in the United Nations Charter, or they're both founded in the United Nations Charter. One is that the Security Council of the United Nations, through an action of a Chapter 7 resolution, has authorized the use of military force to resolve a pressing international security requirement. The second, and that's what we went to war in Desert Storm about. I mean, a lot of people were opposed to that war, and I respect people's opinions. But you can't call it an illegal war, because we actually dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's, checked all the boxes, and we got a Chapter 7 resolution authorizing the use of force. There was a lawful war. The other one is Article 51. For instance, Kuwait, when they were invaded by Iraq, Kuwait invoked Article 51, saying, we're invaded. We have the inherent right to self-defense, but we can't defend ourselves. So we're calling upon, and here's an important concept, collective self-defense. That is, that people come and help us defend ourselves. And I bring that up because Russia invoked Article 51 when it talked about legitimizing its actions. And it did so under the notion, because people say, well, wait a minute, Article 51, you weren't attacked by Ukraine. But what Russia is saying is, no, but Ukraine has been carrying out aggression for 8 years against the Donbass. And people say, but the Donbass is Ukrainian, not Russian, so you don't get Article 51 protection. And Russia say, yes, but before we invoked Article 51, we recognize the independence of these two states, so they're now not part of Ukraine. And people say, yes, but they're not part of the United Nations. Therefore, they don't get United Nations protection. And people go, well, how we beat you, Russia? And Russia says, no, you see, NATO in 1999 attacked Serbia without any Chapter 7 resolution, using collective self-defense notion under Article 51. But people will say, but NATO isn't a member state. So how does NATO get the protection? Because NATO now is classified as a regional security relationship, even though it involves a non-UN member. It's an entity. And what Russia is saying is, what we have created in the link up between us, Donetsk and Lugansk, is a regional security relationship similar to what NATO used in 1999. And that's where we get our Article 51, collective self-defense. Now, the question is, do you have to wait for someone to attack you? Well, preemption this is now the theory of preemption. And this is where Grotius comes in. This is where the Caroline affair comes in, and others. Right off the bat, Russia could make a case, and did make a case, that the imminent threat coming from Ukraine is derived from the humanitarian plight of the people of the Donbass, which has been ongoing for 8 years and was continuing at the time. And therefore, on humanitarian grounds alone, Russia has a right to cite collective self-defense to resolve that which is creating the humanitarian, which is the Ukrainian forces attacking the Russian-speaking part of Donbass. But the problem here is Russia would only be authorized, therefore, to carry out a very limited military operation designed to immediately address those elements of the Ukrainian military that were causing the harm. That they couldn't do this broader attack into Ukraine. So what Russia then did is say Ukraine has been amassing between 60 to 100, I think the number is 120,000 troops in the vicinity of the Donbass for the purpose of launching their own attack against the Russian-speaking populations of Lugansk and Donetsk. The Russians claim, and I've read the documents, I can't forensically evaluate them long distance, but they look legit. They claim to have captured the actual operational plans about this. And so Russia now says that we must preempt this Ukrainian attack, which allows Russia to broaden the scope and bring into concepts such as the denazification, getting rid of the right-wing ideology and the militarized units, and demilitarization, which really means denatoizing, eliminating the Ukrainian military as a proxy of NATO, these forces that were trained and being organized. So that's where Russia gets its legitimacy. And I believe they put together a fairly solid case, at least one that is cognizable before a legal body.
Thank you. Yes, there's always a gap between the legal, what's understood legally and what's understood common sense wise. My daughter being a labor lawyer, she knows that firsthand. But but thanks, that was a great answer, Billy Bob. Back to you.
I know the producer was wanting to go to break. Do we have to go to a break, or is that not necessary?
Yeah, let's just go ahead and do a break, and we'll be right back with Foreign Policy Review. Thanks for watching out there. Dustin Pickering. Are you curious about financial literacy? Then take a look at Professor Anthony Rivecchio's new program on Parrot TV. It's called Financial Focus University. This is an excellent program to learn about questions related to your own finances post-COVID, how you can manage your money, how you can work with your tax situation. And this is an excellent and informative discussion of financial literacy. With Professor Anthony Rivecchio, your financial problems will be solved at Parrot TV with Financial Focus University. Welcome back to Foreign Policy Review. We have Scott Ritter. Billy Bob is a special guest, and Carlo Parcelli, my co-host. So let's continue this discussion. Billy Bob, what were you going to add into the mix here?
Well, I thought Scott's explanation of the legal rationale was great. I hadn't heard that before. Mm-hmm. In a certain sense, what is the term for global, international law? Like international law is kind of like an obstacle to overcome, from the Western perspective. It's not like there's a set laws that people just have to abide by. It's a game. It's a joke, right? I mean, the West, sees it as an obstacle, and they maneuver, and they further their interests. They pursue their interests without any restraint. They don't really abide by international law. But it's interesting to hear Scott's explanation of the Russian rationale for abiding by international law. So I appreciate that. You're a tremendous asset to the working class here, Scott. And so we appreciate everything that you do is really what I would like to say to you. But, I don't have any questions right now that are pressing. Does anybody else want to ask questions, or you want to just let Scott go ahead?
Let me add on to that, what we're seeing right now, and again, this is an insult to many in the West, and indeed many of my fellow Americans. And, people need to understand that, my Marine Corps background should make it obvious. I'm a proud American. Mm-hmm. And I took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I take that oath seriously, not only as a military man, but as a citizen. I believe in the rule of law. But the rule of law has to be applied uniformly and fairly to everybody. And when we step out in the international community, we have a body of international law that's collected in what's called the United Nations Charter. And the interesting thing as an American, because people say, well, that's the UN, that's international people, that's not us, we got the Constitution. Except The Constitution says when the United States Senate has ratified a treaty or agreement and it's been signed by the president, it becomes the law of the land, which means that the United States has embraced the United Nations Charter as the law of the land, therefore binding to the United States. And yet, this is a term that you hear often, especially from the Biden administration. It's a carryover from the Obama administration, the rules-based international order. Now, what's important about the rules-based international order is that it's not law-based, it's rules-based. It's not founded in the principles of the United Nations Charter. It's founded in a series of agreements and the creation of certain alliances and organizations at the end of the Second World War that sought to codify American hegemony. Now, I can defend this at the end of the Second World War because there really wasn't an option out there. The world really needed American leadership. Maybe we didn't do as good of a job as we could have, but we did all right. The Marshall Plan, things of that nature. And one could even say that, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund was a necessary evil to allow the United States to transfer its wealth down to the nations that needed to be rebuilt. But that's not what we used it for. We used it to dominate the world, to create an a rules-based world order that benefited us exclusively. And the Russians have never played this game. Are you familiar with George Kennan? He wrote The Long Telegram. He's the American diplomat. And The Long Telegram created the intellectual foundation for the policy of containment. And containment became militarized through NSD, I think, 68, passed during the Korean War, which defined the relationship between the West and the East as a military relation, the Cold War. But Kennan didn't write about the military threat from Russia. What he wrote about was the fact that the Russians refused to play the Marshall Plan game, that the Russians wouldn't allow the dollar to become the currency of note inside the Soviet Union. They rejected that, and they refused to participate in anything that gave credence to the different financial institutions that the United States was building, because they recognized that once you let those institutions in, you lose all sovereign control of your country. And so Kennan said this is a problem because we have a plan for how we're going to rebuild the world to our benefit, and the Soviets aren't playing the game. So how do we contain this so that the Soviet rejection of our economic dominance doesn't bleed over around the world? So containment was initially purely economic. And then it became military. It turned into the Cold War. But the reason why I'm bringing all of this up is, frankly, I lost my train of thought. But I think I was addressing the point about the rules-based international order, because you were talking about international law. The United States doesn't adhere to international law. We only do so when it's convenient to us. One only needs to look at our justification for going to war with Iraq in 2003, which has been deemed by everybody to be a violation of international law. And yet you never once saw any serious effort by the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice or any nation to bring George Bush to justice, or anybody who, we're screaming for Putin's head right now, and he's playing the game right. We violated everything, nobody screams. But my point isn't to try and pick on Bush. My point is to point out that on February 4th of this year, Vladimir Putin met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. And they they released a 5,000 plus word joint statement that every American should read, because it is the new vision of the world. And it's not a joke. It's a vision that says we reject American single polarity, that the world does no longer revolve around the United States. It's a multipolar world in which Russia and China are two of the major poles that have to be paid attention to. And two, we reject the rules-based world order. This is a fiction created by the United States. And instead, we're returning to a law-based world order that revolves around the Charter of the United Nations. They're not trying to recreate something. They're simply trying to breathe life into something that was created a long time ago. And this is real. I'll give you an example of how real it is. Russia and China just met with Qatar and all the nations that surround Afghanistan, while we have frozen the funds of Afghanistan, creating a human rights disaster inside there, Russia and everybody else got together and said, how do we fix this? And who didn't they invite? The United States. Didn't even consult with us. They just said, the heck with you. You've walked away from this problem. You're trying to control this problem, as you always do, through the threat of economic starvation. So we're done with you. We don't care about your money. We're redefining this. And Russia just recognized, just gave credentials to a Taliban diplomat. That's one step away from actually recognizing the Taliban as a legitimate government of Afghanistan. And when Russia takes the lead, China will follow, everybody else will follow. And next thing you know, despite everything we wanted to accomplish, Russia has created a new reality that the world will deal with. And this is going to happen over and over and over again because of the stupidity of the Biden administration.
Yeah.
We pretended we wanted a divorce. You know, we're like one of those spouses that get mad. I want a divorce. Well, Russia said, okay, you got the divorce. Oh, wait a minute. No, I don't really want a divorce because I don't know how I'm going to make a mortgage payment. I don't know I'm going to pay for the car. How am I going to pay for this and that? Too bad. You asked for a divorce. You got the divorce. The United States claimed it wanted a divorce with Russia. Europe claimed they wanted to be free of Russian gas. You got what you wished for. Now you got to deal with the consequences.
Absolutely.
Your characterization of that reminds me of the absolute opposite characterization we're getting in the American media. Mm-hmm. That is the sheer genius, the sheer beginning years ago of U.S. foreign policy, just the brilliance of it. They realized that Ukraine was the Achilles heel of Russia. They knew this all along, and it's been cited by, don't poke the Russian bear via Ukraine. Kissinger, the current head of the Central Intelligence Agency, Kennan, everybody on Mearsheimer, everybody on down the line, all sides of the aisle. And so so in 2004, they had the color revolution, Soros's Omid Yar's color revolution, and that got rid of Yanukovych once. Then they brought their man back in. Why is his name escaping me? They tried to poison him supposedly, and he recovered somehow. And so they've had this destabilization process going on there. To poking the bear. NATO arming Nazis in Ukraine.
2014 coup.
The 2014 coup. Thank you. The Maidan coup, so on and so forth. So they're poking there, and finally they've gotten the result they wanted. Putin made the huge mistake of invading, and now now the Soviet Union, Russia, has its second Afghanistan. Ooh, and that's what we're getting in the mainstream media, and that's what you hear from the general public, because all they've got is the TV and that crap. But anyway. Let me just speak on that for a moment.
just to say, I want to talk about the genius of American foreign policy.
Yes.
I mean, again, I don't want to come off as somebody who just attacks America. I don't. But
you can leave that to me.
The best friend is the friend that points out the faults and then works with you to correct the faults. And so, I love my country. I recognize the faults, etc. But the hubris that's attached to the notion of the genius of American foreign policy. Understand that foreign policy is the sole purview of the executive branch, that the president alone gets to dictate what foreign policy priorities are in a given administration. So let's just talk about times from, say, let's start with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, and we'll say that George H.W. Bush was sort of a 4-year extension of the Reagan thing, but because they had some of the same foreign policy minds, et cetera. So we had 12 years of transitioning from the evil empire to arms control and real détente and actual friendship. Ronald Reagan traveled to Moscow in June of 1988 and told a collection of Soviet students, he said, I don't view you as the evil empire anymore. I view you as friends. So that's a heck of a transition. Then Bush loses election, as happens in democracies, and Bill Clinton came in. But what you have to know is that American foreign policy, that 12 years of consistency stopped right there. Boom, done. And in came a new group of people who thought exactly different. They had a different vision. And for 8 years, we got the Bill Clinton vision. And I'm not being critical. I'm just saying it was different from the Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush vision. And then in Clinton, Al Gore ran for election, got beat by or got the system put in George W. Bush. And then for 8 years, we got a whole different foreign policy. And then after 8 years of George W. Bush, we got Barack Obama and a completely different foreign policy. And then if you really want to screw it up, we get 4 years of Donald Trump, who changed everything about what we're doing. And now we've shifted back to Joe Biden, who is reinventing the wheel all over again. But you can't speak of the genius of American foreign policy because it is a stop and go proposition. It's all over the map, literally 180-degree transitions after a period of time. You know who has a consistent foreign policy? Russia. Since 1999, they've had one man calling the shots. And from 1999 to 2002, Russian foreign policy has been unbroken in terms of its logic, its consistency, its application. So if you want to sit here and this is what gets me. I'm not saying the Russians are doing everything right. They're not. But I am saying that the Russians have been consistent in the application of their foreign policy theories for 22 years, as opposed to the United States, which has been all over the map. So if people want to sit there and talk about the brilliance, how can you be brilliant in the Biden administration if you've only been in office for a little bit more than a year and you're going up against a man who's been running his country for 22 years and directing the foreign policy of his country in a vision that has not been broken by the inconsistencies of the interference of democracy. So that's what I wanted to say, is that we need to put things in perspective. I'm not saying that American foreign policy, people who conceive and implement aren't smart. There's some very smart people. I am saying, though, that you're playing catch up a lot of the times. You have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of inefficiency in our operation. There's a lot of assumptions being made that aren't necessarily backed by reality. But when the Russians make an assumption, they have 22 years of consistency to fall back on, which means when they assume something, probably is going to be that which they assume. When Biden assumes something, there's no guarantees that the American system is ready to make that transition. There will have to be more time brought in. A lot of inefficiency, not as genius as everybody likes to believe it is.
Yeah, I'm here in Washington, and I see that genius at work every day. Especially being my profession is a used and rare book dealer, so I do know that in Northern Virginia, for example, where a lot of the policy wonks, the lower level people, as you pointed out earlier, that's where you get the best books at the book sales. That's where you get the history, the serious history, and those people read up on it. But they're not the major errand boys and girls. Victoria Newland, she's a major errand girl, and her husband Robert Kagan, he's a major errand girl. I'd like to read just a quote from Errand Boy, Errand Girl, Errand Boy. I'd like to read just a quote from Ted Postal in an interview he did with Ray McGovern, which I think really captures the kind of people we're dealing with here. Postal goes, I have taught at Stanford, I have taught at MIT, I have taught at Princeton and at Harvard. So I know what a lot of those people are because they are privileged. This is, of course, a generalization. There are certainly some extremely intelligent and thoughtful people among these, but a great bulk of these people are just completely in love with themselves. They're convinced that they know a lot more than they do. They will not listen. They're not interested in learning. I mean, you try to present facts to them, and they sort of walk away from you laughing. And that captures, to me, my experience over 73 years in my hometown here of D.C. with these assholes. So I just wanted to.
Wait, we get to use colorful. We get to use colorful language.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've missed other shows.
Yeah,
we've been mild today.
Don't give a green light to bad language to a Marine, man. That's dangerous world.
No, go
for it.
A second, I'd like to expand on what you were talking about in a way that brings it back to this. You know, when I said I was foreign area officer, and that's primarily based upon my experience, my on-hands experience in the Soviet Union as a weapons inspector, combined with my academic experience. But the fact is, when I was studying the Soviet Union, people could take 6-month study abroads and go to Moscow or St. Petersburg in a very controlled environment and get a glimpse into Soviet reality, but it wasn't real. It was controlled. We had to work overtime to study primary sources. We had to study Russian culture from the ground up, read Dostoevsky, read Chekhov, read Tolstoy, and then Pushkin, and then speculate, talk about what they were thinking, what the Russian mind is like. And so we worked very hard so that we could understand our enemy. And that's how I viewed them, as my enemy. But, if you don't understand your enemy, you're going to lose the war. Right. You're going to get it wrong. Sun Tzu, one of his basic precepts in the art of war, know your enemy as yourself. So we worked overtime to do this. And we got it wrong a lot of times, but sometimes we got it right. And give you an example. There was a guy named Richard Pipes, a very noted Russian, a Soviet historian, taught at Harvard. His book on the history of Soviet nationalities, the formation of the Soviet Union, is a classic. I still have a first edition volume in my own little bookshelf back here. But the fact is, and he was a hardcore right winger. He advised Ronald Reagan about the evil empire. So I didn't agree with his conclusions, but I respected his methodology to get there. Meaning that he didn't make stuff up. He didn't simplify things. He had a grasp of the minutia of Russian history, Russian culture, Russian language, and how they interacted with everything. And you created some very people with a depth of knowledge and insight, such as, for example, Jack Matlock, who was the ambassador to the Soviet Union when I worked over there. He is a Russian scholar. He is somebody who knows Russian culture intimately. He's the real deal. Now, you don't have to agree with the conclusions that Jack Matlock do. I happen to agree with them, but I can understand how somebody might say, well, his conclusions are a little too liberal, or his conclusions are a little too this for my take. Fine, we respect the process. Mm-hmm. Then what happened? The wall comes down, the Soviet Union opens up, and now we have access to everything. We can go in and read the archives that we've only been speculating about. I had to speculate about modern day Soviet activity by reading Meryl Feinzahn's book about Soviet rule in Smolensk, where the Germans captured the Smolensk archives about what happened in the 1930s, and he wrote a brilliant book about it. And that's how I gained insight into how the Soviet Union worked. But I was speculating, I was projecting. People now could go in when the Soviet Union fell and Russia came in and gain access to the actual archives. End of speculation, total access to information, and you'd think that people would be foaming at the mouth to get in there and do this. But instead we get Michael McFaul. Michael McFaul is a Stanford educated, or instead we get Fiona Hill. Instead we get Ann Applebaum. Instead I could just go on and on and on. People who didn't have the roadblocks to knowing the Russians that I had. And yet people who claim to be Russian experts without doing the work. Mm-hmm. People who focus not on understanding the Russian psyche, the psychology, the Russian mind, Homo Sovieticus, Homo Slavus, whatever you want to call it. Instead, they went in and said, how can we exploit this situation to our benefit? Michael McFaul is not a Russian scholar. Michael McFaul is a Russian exploiter. Michael McFaul's entire being is focused around using the excuse of bringing democracy to Russia for the reality of how America can dominate Russia, subordinate Russia, make it a Slavish, weak nation that benefits us, not them. That's Michael McFaul. Same with Fiona Hill. And then Putin came in, and instead of people trying to understand Putin's rise to power within the context of Russian reality, they instead oversimplify it by saying he's a KGB agent, he's an autocrat, he's a dictator. Everybody whose named I just mentioned, you want to know why they got into the U.S. government? Not because they're Russian experts. There's not a single Russian expert in the U.S. government today, because you can't be a Russian expert in the U.S. government, because then you'd be trying to talk common sense. What you are is an anti-Putin partisan. Go back and look. I've read every single one of their PhD theses. They're all on the autocratic nature of Putin's leadership, government, et cetera, et cetera. And when you read them, they're just childlike in the simplicity that they apply to the problem. That's the reality of what we call a Russian expert today. We don't have them. One of the last real ones, Stephen Cohen, just passed away. He was a genuine Russian expert. Jack Matlock is 92 years old. I hope he lives to be 102 or even more. But he's on the latter part of his life cycle, not the early part. All the people that you see on TV today, they're not Russian experts, and they should not be treated as such. And yet we call them that, and we believe that there's actually insight into Russia when they talk about Putin, when the reality is they don't even know who Putin is.
Yeah,
we've concluded with the hour.
Oh, right.
Just want to remind everybody that
man, it's over.
Thanks so much for you guys.
I apologize.
No,
rambled on.
Great. You brought a lot of expertise to the show today. So thanks for joining us, Scott. It's been really interesting, entertaining, and thought-provoking. This has been the Foreign Policy Review, brought to you by Parrot TV, and I'm Dustin Pickering. We had Scott Ritter today on the show, Billy Bob's special guest, and my co-host, CARLO Parcelli. Keep an eye out for future programming from Parrot TV and World Inkers Network. And remember, you guys out there, get to some reading done, do some thinking, and don't take everything for granted. Do some research of your own, and thanks for watching. Have a great day. World Inkers Monthly Magazine is a fine source for your literary interests. It's an all-source magazine with poetry, prose, and essays and articles, as well as interviews. It's all full-color art and photography from a variety of voices and artists. You will find this magazine entertaining. This is an all-purpose readership, and we are looking for new voices. This sleek, full-color edition of World Inkers Monthly Magazine will be something pleasant for your eyes as well as for your mind. And we're looking for authors for one book promotion in the magazine. If you're a business, we want to promote your business. You may submit your book reviews, your academic or non-academic articles on the humanities and the arts, as well as your literary writing and creative output, to publication.worldinkers@gmail.com. World Inkers Monthly Magazine does not spare any ink. Keep inking for World Inkers Monthly Magazine.